Well, thank you for being part of this project of talking to people about our collective racial justice journey and how that relates to the Religious Society of Friends, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and in your case, the Poor People's Campaign. What has happened, what just happened, what's coming up? Yeah, tell us about the PPC.
For sure, and I'm very grateful to be here and be part of this, Zachary. I've been working with AFSC over about a year and a half now, and I started last year working in youth programs. So for a year, I was really entrenched in the way that AFSC orgs and partners seek to make change in a youth-focused way. And that work propelled me into the Poor People's Campaign, to getting involved and being this sort of liaison organizer between AFSC and the Poor People's Campaign. So AFSC is a mobilizing partner with the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign is national, as many people know. It's all over the United States, but is mainly run by the states. So Pennsylvania campaign, the California campaign, the Iowa campaign, all have similar goals, all are working with the same calls to action, and we are united as a national campaign, but we operate on the state level because we are based in grassroots organizing, just in the same way that AFSC is. So the Poor People's Campaign, we're working mostly with Pennsylvania and also now with the New Jersey campaign, since we cover the entire Philadelphia area, which is really exciting for me. And so what that looks like right now is, number one, doing concerted actions with the rest of the Poor People's Campaign. So the Poor People's Campaign is made up of a coordinating committee, and a coordinating committee is made up about 15 or so organizations that are doing on the ground work. So they might be getting licenses for undocumented people. They might be helping mothers obtain their benefits. They might be organizing for fair and equitable housing. All of the areas, the 4 issue areas, if you might call them, of the Poor People's Campaign, these organizations are doing that work, have been doing that work for a very, very long time, and are coming together to speak across the different issues. So what we're saying with that is that racism and ecological devastation and militarism and all the rest of the issues all speak to one another, right? They're not disconnected. In fact, they are very deeply connected to one another. So we do this work in sort of this coalition-based way so that we're not distracting from the intersectionality between all of these issues, but instead we're drawing attention to it. So we often iterate to people that the Poor People's Campaign is not its own organization. It's a coalition of organizations, because if it were to be just an organization and not bringing all of these folks together, we would leave a lot out. We would miss a lot, and we would also end up, which happens a lot, sort of speaking over one another, not intentionally, but a lot of the times we miss those key intersections, which can be really easy to see or really hard to see. So what my work looks like in the Poor People's Campaign specifically is organizing Quakers across Philadelphia region to be involved in the Poor People's Campaign through educational efforts, through getting involved in different actions. So for example, we had this car caravan that happened a few weeks ago, and it was tremendously successful. We had speakers from all of these different organizations speaking at key sites. So we had someone at the Justice Center. We had folks all the way out in Delco speaking on immigration, and we had people at Family Court. So we had a tour of a real life tour of what exactly does poverty, racism, etc. look like? How does it manifest in our community? And then also, how do we disrupt how do we disrupt? And we took over the streets, and we drove slow. We did what we had to do to be seen and heard. And so it's very, very exciting. That was kind of one of our local actions, and then there are national actions. So there was the big June 20th call, which was the televised march, which would have been everyone coming down to DC, but instead there were, I think, 2.1 million people came online, listened to an incredible host of speakers from all around the country. And there was Reverend Barber, who personally really speaks to my work. And I have spoken about him to a lot of Quakers. A lot of people are really energized by him and the things that he brings to the movement. And so that June 20th march has set out our foundation. So now is the time that we're going to start building on that. We're going to start building on this critical knowledge of what are the issues and how do they work for and with and against one another. And then now is the point where we're saying, what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that, you mentioned the fact that the June 20th march couldn't be a march because of the pandemic. I'm wondering, like, how else has the Poor People's Campaign been affected by the recent series of uprisings against police brutality, and anything else that the pandemic maybe has shifted things now that we're where we are and aren't, and it's unclear what will be up next.
That's very true. And the pandemic, I'll start with that, has had a really sizable impact on how the Poor People's Campaign carries out its goals, but also it has caused a really key, not restructuring, but I think it has placed emphasis on certain areas of our agenda and of our principles that a lot of people weren't seeing or had a hard time understanding before all of this. So if we look now at all of the campaigns to cancel rent, that housing is in fact a human right. If we look at how neighbors have been helping one another get food, and we've been protecting immunocompromised people, and really understanding the ways in which we all must rely on one another, number one, and number two, how poor people and how people of color are disproportionately impacted. So with COVID, for example, it's become very, very clear in number one, the infections, and in the response from the government. I mean, the negligence from the government has caused actually the Poor People's Campaign to put out a series of COVID-specific demands that you can see on the website. And we've also released this Jubilee platform, as we call for Jubilee, which is based in some Christian principles, but is also resonant with a lot of different spiritual communities, in that we're demanding that everyone have a right to live, and that right to live includes things like healthcare for all. It includes things like healthy food and sustenance. And it also includes a radical restructuring in how we protect ourselves and protect one another. So with also the intersecting, the simultaneous outbreak, the pandemic of racial violence that has been going on far longer than COVID, this has always been a campaign with a racial justice lens, with an anti-racist lens, and that holds systemic racism at the center of all of these issues. But I think that in terms of bringing people into the Poor People's Campaign, there was actually so these caravans that I referenced back on, I think it was June 14th, these caravans took place all over the state of Pennsylvania. And in Harrisburg, they had this incredible moment where their Jubilee caravan, they were called, intersected with the Black Lives Matter march that was happening that day.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a bit of confusion because they were coming in opposite directions and literally colliding with one another. And a lot of the Black Lives Matter activists were asking, what is the Poor People's Campaign? What do you all do? And so it was this incredible conversation and almost the melding of these two groups. I think it's really a physical manifestation of how movements come together, but also we're never really separate in the first place. The fact that we're all taking to the streets for the same reason, essentially, is really powerful. It's a really powerful image. So I bring that up to say that I think that the systemic racism piece of the Poor People's Campaign is bringing a lot of folks into the conversation in a different way. I think that previously it seemed to folks on the outside that this looked exclusively like policy change, or it looked exclusively like things that look very, very specific or very bureaucratic. And I think that now we're seeing it's becoming unignorably, unquestionably clear that it actually is happening from the grassroots level. It must happen from the grassroots level. That uprooting the seeds of racism takes everyone, and we can't wait for lawmakers or people in these forms of centralized power to make those changes for us. Rather, they need to come from within our communities. So whether it's coming from our churches, our spiritual groups, our families, these are the units that are at the front lines of this, really. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign has always stood for historically, is this grassroots uprising of the people who are actually disproportionately impacted.
Yeah, thanks for elucidating that. I'm curious, what do you feel like is like the thing for in the next 6 months that, like, if we want to get more local Quaker communities involved, how would you recommend that, like, Quakers in a monthly meeting or in some other kind of local group, what would be the steps to take to get involved, and what would that involvement look like? Is it like, is it giving money? Is it showing up to an event? Is it helping spread the word about something? Is it building relationships of accountability? Like, what does that look like?
I love this question. So the past couple of months, a lot of my task has been to set the groundwork, create a base in a few meetings. So I've been able to form some great relationships in some meetings, have plans to form some in others now. And recently, 2 weeks ago, I worked with some folks at AFSC to put together this bell tolling for Black Lives event, which was inspired by a Tolling Together campaign that was put out by the National Poor People's Campaign. And Tolling Together was originally formulated for folks to commemorate COVID deaths several months ago. This came out in maybe April. And we looked at this action and really thought that it was resonant for Quakers. And we retooled it and made it a memorial commemoration for Black lives lost to police violence, police brutality, and white vigilante violence. So with that event, which will be airing on Facebook Live in a few weeks.
Oh, cool.
We're going to have a watch party. Folks came out, they told bells and said names and read poetry, spoke a little bit about their meeting's history in racial justice movement and in abolition. And it was really powerful, happening in a socially distant way, and across 5 different Quaker meetings in our area. So that was really an exciting action for me, because that is the type of thing that builds that base. So using actions like this, which start out symbolic and then become a lot more rooted in community and rooted in material action, is sort of the way that this is building.
Mm.
So over the next 6 months, the work that I'm seeing is, number one, working with meetings to integrate the Poor People's Campaign and a lot of the history into their religious ed curriculums. That's something I'm working with one meeting on, and would love to work with others on doing, getting their youth involved. Because as I said, my background is really in youth organizing. And I thoroughly believe that any type of movement is really undergirded by young people and young people's knowledge, young people's, lived experiences. So building that understanding among youth in Quaker meetings is going to be really, really significant. And second, I'm putting together a series of groups. So some meetings have gone through this Poor People's Campaign 101 workshop that I put together with the help of some folks in the PA Poor People's Campaign, some folks at AFSC that goes through Quaker history in the Poor People's Campaign. And it's very reflective. It's very rooted in deciding, well, where is my experience with these issues? What do I know from my own life? What have I witnessed? What have I lived? And what have I not? So, and then where do I and my Quaker community fit into this action? So building off of those meetings, who have participated in Poor People's Campaign 101 or would like to host the Poor People's Campaign 101, which I am very, very happy to run with folks. That's sort of the inroad. So we take that, and then now the Poor People's Campaign in PA and in New Jersey are putting together these action committees post June 20th, where people can be linked to those grassroots groups that make up state campaigns. So like I said, there's 12 or 15, and we're still coming up with the ways that we can best link folks to those organizations so that they can be involved on the ground in a real and material way. And you brought up donations, and I think that's a really good thing to point out, because something that has come to my attention in this moment, both in the movement for Black Lives and with COVID response, is that it's been really interesting seeing where people are putting resources. A lot of large national organizations have received more donations than they can ever know what to do with. And they do know what to do with them, and they'll put them to good use. But something I am urging people to do and to be conscious about is when they make donations and when they are, looking to fund the work that they believe in, the work that they're passionate about, the work that they know needs to be happening, to look on the local level. So to really get deep in the research about who is making this stuff happen in your community. So whether that's in Philadelphia, or if that's in South Jersey, or if that is in Delaware County, looking through news sources, going through social media is really a fantastic window into these things and into this information. See who is running the marches, who is running the rallies, and who, most importantly to me, is providing aid, real tangible aid to people who are impacted by systemic racism. So that might be the Philly chapter of Black Lives Matter. It might be a fund for local trans people looking for places to live who need funding to move. It might look like funding a park and community center in a Black neighborhood. But I urge people to, if they're going to redistribute funds and resources, which is key in this moment and in every moment, to look on the local level.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, because it feels like looking on the local level and the work that Quakers need to be up to has a lot to do with realizing what stake we all have in each other's liberation, and how if that means that we need to be thinking about our neighbors as like our physical neighbors, as well as our neighbors across the continent.
Exactly right, yeah.
Well, and I'm curious if you had any other comments or words of wisdom or experiences you wanted to share about what PYM is doing in terms of its work with addressing racism, and or in terms of its role in the world given this pandemic and given the uprising that we're in right now, or anything else you wanted to share?
Certainly, certainly. I think that in my engagements with friends across PYM programs, and I've actually had such a unique pleasure not only to engage with adults in these meetings, but with young people, with middle schoolers and high schoolers, and that's been really wonderful to me in running workshops and running the action that I mentioned. And I've learned a lot. I've learned a whole lot about what people have in terms of knowledge and also what they're looking for. And so I think that PYM is in a really special position right now to provide some of these key linkages between what people need, meeting people where they're at, and going from there. So, for example, this past week, I was mentioning to you, I was presenting at Friends General Conference, doing a resistant build training with my colleague, Nia Eubanks-Dixon at AFSC. And that training is about, number one, understanding the intersections and impacts of racism and colonialism, and then talking about how we can build a different world. How can we build a world where we are actively undoing those things and we're building new structures and new ways of building community that go fundamentally against those things. So that, and I did have some friends who were local attend that, which was fantastic. And it seems to me that people are really hungry for opportunities to go inside and to really delve deep into their own personal journeys toward anti-racism and towards decolonizing. So I know anti-racism has gotten more attention now than I think ever in that sense, the word anti-racism. So we're not just talking about not being racist, or we're not talking about, multiculturalism or inclusion, but we're talking explicitly about being anti-racist, and that's a very deep and complicated journey. And so for me, what I've come to understand with a lot of friends is that looks like revisiting how they have come to know themselves, whether they're white or whether they're people of color, understanding where racism and where colonialism live in their minds and in their practices, and how can they undo those things. So I think that in terms of programming, I'm always thinking about programming, or programs person, and programming that accompanies people on this journey and allows for that intra-group dialogue, that dialogue of what do I do with me? Because so much of this conversation can become about, well, what can I do for someone else? Does someone need me to do something for them? But really, the more difficult part is to go within and say, where is this been internalized for me? What conversations do I need to be having with myself, with my family, with folks in my meeting? Where do racism and colonialism live in our practices, and what we do and how we conduct meeting? And actually, in my FGC session, we had some great conversations about that. Folks were bringing to the table questions about how they allocate resources in their meetings. They were talking about just how they conceptualize things like time and timeliness and being early or late, how those are rooted in white supremacy. We were talking with people about how they can have discussions about their history that is nuanced. So something that came up was the history of Quakers and Quakers' role in colonialism, especially in Latin America. A lot of people were coming with stories about having families or themselves being missionaries, and how do we unpack that history and truly deal with it? So those are sort of the questions and the histories that I think PYM is in the position to help guide people through. I think that those are the things that will be the base for transformation for meetings. And I'll also say that bringing young people into the conversation in a concerted way. So having conversations that bring young people, and that's, you know, little kids, and that's high schoolers, and that's college students and young adults. But bringing their voices into the conversation is really key, because something I always am amazed about is that as a millennial, I am a member of the generation that brought Black Lives Matter into being, which is incredible, which is so powerful. Because even the statement, even the name of Black Lives Matter is truly just deeply about humanity, is about the ways in which this society, and I'm not just talking about the United States, I'm talking about, you know, white supremacy as a global system, has said just the opposite for so many centuries. And so millennials and Generation Z after us are really on the front lines of this. And that looks like being the folks who are coming up with incredible propositions, incredible demands. You know, we look at just how those, I don't know if this is something folks have seen, but a platform of reform was 8 to reform. I forget the exact name, but we've come back at a lot of these reformist tendencies with a clear demand for abolition of police, abolition of prisons, and that's very, very exciting. And I think it's time, it's been time to pass over that leadership and to also pass down knowledge. That's something a lot of young people, I was just on a call in AFSC with some of our folks in youth programs in Minneapolis. And those young people, we asked them, what do you need? And they said, we really need for older folks to pass down knowledge, to tell us their stories of when they were out in the streets 50, 40, 30 years ago. You know, were you involved in the civil rights movement? Were you involved in ACT UP? What were the movements that have led to the movement that we have today? Whose shoulders are we standing on? We really need that information. We really need to be having those intergenerational conversations while we're also passing the torch. I think that's incredibly key. And the last thing that I'll make note of is our conversations about abolition. And I referenced this, but AFSC put out a really strong piece about our commitment to the abolition of police. And I encourage folks to read that. And also Lucy Duncan put out an article recently on the AFSC blog on this topic. And I think right now is a time for, when we're thinking about systemic change, who are we asking about what systemic changes need to happen? Who are we consulting with? And that needs to be people who are directly impacted, right? And there's been a lot of resistance to the abolition narratives, to the calls for abolition. And I've seen abolition just be completely co-opted online, in in-person conversations, in big news outlets and small news outlets. I've seen people say things like, well, defunding police just means that we're going to shrink police budgets, and things like that. But actually, we're talking about a long-term strategy, right? We're talking about a strategy that seeks to weaken a system that has grown out of slavery and grown out of Jim Crow and just been strengthened over the years to kill and marginalize Black people and immigrants and other people who are impacted by white supremacy. And the call for abolition, I think, really needs to be upheld. I think right now there's a lot of different narratives coming out of different sources And I ask people to, number one, consider their sources. Where are they getting their news from? Is their news coming from directly impacted people, or is it coming from people who are crafting a narrative and are sort of on the outside looking in, right? And that's a colonial perspective, to speak for those people over there, those people who are experiencing this thing and it doesn't impact me. But in reality, you know, white supremacy and police brutality, they do impact all people, right? Living under these systems does not allow anyone to live in their whole humanity. It's dehumanizing for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And a text I'll put out there for folks is My Grandmother's Hands. I was recently referring to that book. And that's one that really draws that point out and makes it very clear that these systems ultimately serve to keep us all living outside of our whole potential, our whole selves, and alienate us from our bodies, from one another, from the true sense, true meaning of community.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ask people, you know, consider where you're learning about these movements. Consider where you're seeing videos coming from. Are they coming from, you know, nightly news? Are they coming from Twitter? Are they coming from Facebook? To take a step back and really contemplate who is telling this story, why are they telling this story, what stake do they have in telling this story, and then seek out information from directly impacted people, from Black media outlets, from queer outlets, from all of these sources that are stifled, that are underfunded, but are certainly out there. And with the internet, we're really fortunate to have more access than before. And I tell people we have this information at our fingertips, and we have to be very strategic about where information is coming from, what we're sharing, what we're putting out there, and what we're consuming and putting into our minds and hearts.
Yeah, thank you for sharing with all of that. I really hope that a lot of people watch this interview and let that inspire, let that be an inspiration to either invite you out for a workshop and get involved in the PPC, or do some other work with their whatever is happening in their local communities, towards abolition and towards all the other work that is needed. It really feels like maybe more people are under the weight of a wake-up call that we've needed for generations. And so I hope that PYM can be a source of stoking those flames and getting everyone sustainably committed for the long haul. And I appreciate you willing to talk with us today.
Certainly. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I agree with you. I'm really looking forward to what comes of this moment that will carry us into a new world.